Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to another great show of the Van Buren Variety Show. As you know, I am your host week after week. I am Bob Van Buren. So glad you're here, all my regulars that come in week after week to watch the show. And I want to say a special hello to the visitors and the newcomers watching this show tonight. Thanks for tuning in. And in case you are new, for those of you that are new, if you're wondering what this show is all about, keyword is variety there. As you know, week after week, Tuesday evenings at 7 p.m. Central Time, 8 p.m. Eastern Time, right here on YouTube. Look up Van Buren Variety. That's Van Buren Variety. Week after week, I have an individual guest to talk about an interesting subject. Could be the person's profession. It might be some research. Might be some musical entertainment. Might be a hobby. Or just something they've been interested in a while. So if you're new, make sure you hit that subscribe button here on Van Buren Variety, and you can keep track of the upcoming guests coming. So I think you're going to enjoy what you see here. And make sure if you can't tune in live, just make sure you watch the recorded episodes from past, and I think you'll find something you like. I've had a very, very great week so far. It's been a busy week. And for my regulars, you will notice that I am on the air 1 hour after I still have a full-time job, and work has to come first because that pays the bills. So hence, that's why this show was broadcast live 1 hour later than normal, but we should be back to our normal schedule next week. Again, that's Tuesday evenings at 7 p.m. Central Time and 8 p.m. Eastern Time, where we'll have, of course, a great guest as we always do. I did some research myself. I wanted to share this with you. I've got a dollar coin here. And a lot of you are probably wondering, what's with a dollar coin? Everybody can get a dollar coin. What about a dollar coin like this? Can y'all see that? I don't know if y'all can see that or not. It's like a Liberty dollar. But what makes this one special, it's old, all right. I don't know if you can see that or not. Very bottom, you can't really see it. 1922. And I've had this probably for almost all my life. So 1922 dollar, I guess you call that a Liberty coin. Don't know if it's worth anything, but it's a keepsake. So I'm like, wow, it's 100 years old as of now. So I wanted to share that with you. I'm not a coin collector by any means, but this is probably one of the oldest. This is the oldest coin in my collection. So pretty cool. So, but no, it's not for sale. Sorry. Well, it's enough about coins. I have got a guest tonight, and also a subject that a lot of you I know are really into and really, really like to hear more of. And this is a subject that I myself am getting more familiar with. So let's just bring him on right now without further ado. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to Brian King Sharp of Sasquatch Odyssey. Brian, welcome to the Van Buren Variety Show.
Hey, Bob. Thanks for having me, man. I'm glad to be here.
Well, let's just kind of start off. Tell us about your podcast. How long has it been going on? What do you talk about? When is it on? And where can they see it?
Well, anywhere you get your podcast, you can find Sasquatch Odyssey. It was born out of my interest in the subject, some of the things that happened to me earlier on in life. And I was born and raised in Northwest Georgia. So I grew up in the North Georgia mountains, and I was hearing stories about Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and hairy men, all kinds of different things. They went by different names when people would tell their stories. And those stories just fascinated me as a child. So
Sure.
I was into Bigfoot. I was into cryptids. I watched The Incredible Hulk growing up. It was one of my favorite shows.
I love that show.
$6 Million Man, The Bionic Woman, all those kind of weird sort of sci-fi kind of things. And Bigfoot was just always one of those things that really, really interested me. And I had some experiences when I was around 12 years old hunting, and I was out in the woods, and I believe that I may have been paced out of the woods by what I now know to be a Sasquatch. So
Wow.
I grew up and I always had those interests, but I went into law enforcement, and I was in law enforcement for 16 years. And you don't really talk about Bigfoot and UFOs and some of the other things that I experienced. I had a UFO experience when I was 16, and you just don't talk about that on the job. Most people don't, if you want to be seen as a sane person.
Yeah, I've been there. Yes.
So I sort of suppressed that, and I left that job in 2016, and I really started diving into researching the subject, looking into Bigfoot. I didn't really listen to any podcast. I wasn't a podcast listener, and somebody turned me on to a podcast that talked about Sasquatch encounters, and I was hooked. The second I heard it, I thought, wow, that is really compelling stuff, right? Either these people are 100% totally off their rocker, they're making all this up, or they're really having experiences with things that they can't explain. So I guess it was probably late 2020. I really started thinking about, I really want to document as many cases of this as I can where I grew up in Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, in the southeastern United States. So I started looking in, just like you and I met on Facebook. I started getting in these groups and started having conversations with people. And I was like, hey, you know, has anybody had any Bigfoot encounters? And people started reaching out to me. And I was like, well, okay, would you mind talking to me? So I started calling people, and I was literally recording the show on my phone. And the audio quality was horrible, but I was talking to people, and I was documenting these encounters that people were sharing with me. So, and in some cases, I was the first person that ever told about their encounter. And I thought, well, what am I going to do with this, right? So I want other people to hear it. That's me hearing it is one thing, but I want other people to hear it so they learn from it as well. What better way to do that than to start a podcast, very similar to some of the other ones that I was listening to. So I started the podcast. I think I posted the first episode of Sasquatch Odyssey back February, I think it was February 21st of 2021. And of course, you're familiar with this. You know what it's like when you first start a show. You're the only one there. Nobody's listening, right? It's crickets in the audience. And slowly but surely, as I started producing these episodes, people started listening, and more people listened. And I think I was telling you before we went on the air, you know, I did the show for about a year, and in March of 2022, I was able to leave my full-time job to podcast full-time and make this a career. So,
wow, awesome. Happy for you.
I appreciate that. So it just kind of has grown into so many things, you know, with the popularity of the show. I've met so many amazing people and got to do so many amazing things. And we can talk about as much or any and all of that as you want. You know, I just got back from Tennessee. I was up there, and I got to go on stage and handle the encounters portion of the Smoky Mountain Bigfoot Conference and hang out with, you know, finding Bigfoot was a huge show in my life. You know, I didn't watch a lot of it. I famously have said that plenty of times on my show. I wasn't a huge fan of Finding Bigfoot, but I knew what it was. And I just spent the weekend hanging out with Cliff Barrickman, Renee Holland, and Matt Moneymaker from Finding Bigfoot at this conference.
Wow.
And talking to so many amazing people, and it was a really great time. So, but that's a long-winded answer to a very short question. So that's how the show started. The show is really all about having a safe place and a safe space for people to come and share their encounter stories and not feel crazy. That was the whole purpose behind my show, is to give people a platform to talk about their encounters and look at the subject in a really scientific way and take it very seriously, and be able to come and tell their stories, and at the end of the interview not feel like I was looking at them like they had 5 heads. So that's really what it's all about. And it's grown into, it started with encounter stories, but I've had tons of people on the show that are well-known researchers in the field. That's part of, it's kind of a 50-50 mix between Joe Blow and Jane from down the street, who may or may not have seen Bigfoot, that want to share their encounters. And then some of the biggest names in Bigfoot, like Cliff Barrickman's been on the show. You know, Dr. Jeff Meldrum's been on the show. Les Stroud, the Survivor Man, if any of you guys are familiar with that show, I've had Les on the show. He's had Bigfoot experiences that he shared with us. So that's what the show's really all about, man.
And I appreciate that, because, you know, a lot of people are afraid to come forward. They'll think, oh, they've lost their marbles. They don't know what they're talking about. They're crazy. You know, and I can relate. Now, it's a little bit different vein, but I told you before the show, as my audience has heard many times, I had a very horrifying paranormal experience when I was young. And there, I mean, I have met my skeptics. They don't say it, but you can tell the way they look like, listen, you weren't there. You didn't see it. You didn't feel it. You didn't hear what I heard and seen what I saw. So, yeah, and I'm glad you've got a forum like that people can tell their stories. So I'm going to bring your that up on the screen right now. This is your podcast, correct?
Yes, and you can get it on, that's the link to Apple Podcasts. So if you have an Apple iPhone, you can go to Apple Podcasts. You can find it there. If you do a search, by the time you get to SASQ, my show should be popping up. And same thing with Spotify, Google, iHeartRadio, anywhere you listen to podcasts, you can find it. I can't participate I haven't joined the chat. So I see a couple of people I want to say hello to. in the chat. Sandra Piper, hello. Bat Mom, hello. I know those familiar names. I've been on other shows as a guest, and they're always in there watching. So I really appreciate you guys being here and supporting Bob and participating in the chat tonight.
And I will say that also Gary Spike Sr. and Midwest Night Watchers are some of my loyal fans too. They're here week after week, so I appreciate y'all being in. And I will say this, obviously they are very much into the Sasquatch realm, I guess you could say.
Realm is a good word.
Okay. Now, for people that may be watching this, maybe not live, but maybe days, weeks, months, years from now, let's just kind of take them baby steps. You know, when you say Sasquatch, are you meaning only Bigfoot, or can Sasquatch mean other things?
Well, to me, Sasquatch means Bigfoot. Those two words are interchangeable, right?
Okay.
And obviously, we don't know what they are. You know, some people have issues. I am a skeptic. I've make no qualms about being a skeptic on the show. I have had experiences of my own. I've had really weird things happen to me on my property here in North Carolina, but I haven't seen one of these things. So, and I say it all the time on the show. I never have anybody on the show that I don't believes that they had the experience that they've had, right? Just because I haven't had that experience doesn't mean that it's not real and it's not their experience. But I am a skeptic when it comes to the subject in general. Now, obviously, I have come to believe, I have friends that I know personally who have had experiences, who have seen these things multiple times. And it's very difficult to have conversations with them and then walk away and say, I don't believe that exists. But for me, as a skeptical person, I guess to really push me over the threshold, I would have to have one of those experiences myself to 100% come out without any qualms about saying, yes, these things are 100% real. But for me, Sasquatch, Bigfoot is kind of an interchangeable word that means the exact same thing, right?
I will ask you this now, just overall in a broad paintbrush, if you will, the people that you've had on your show to talk about their Sasquatch encounters, would you say on the all that maybe they've been good encounters where maybe the Sasquatch is curious and doesn't cause any harm? Or are you seeing the opposite where he's aggressive, mean, you know, maybe threatening? Or do you see maybe a little bit of both?
Well, it's a very good question. And I answer it this way. I guess mean or aggressive is subjective to some people. What I would consider, there's been some very interesting encounters that I've documented. I've got about 334 episodes of the show out at this point. Okay. So it's a lot of interviews, right? And I would say the majority of them were innocuous, would be a good word for it. It's they've seen it from a distance. They've seen it driving by in a car. They saw it from another ridge line. It wasn't a very close-up encounter. Then there are some close-up encounters, and they were not necessarily aggressive, but the person was obviously scared because of the situation and the size, in most cases, of the creature that they were encountering. I've only documented one case that comes to mind where a person was actually assaulted by a Sasquatch.
Assaulted? Oh,
yes.
Wow.
And I say that, I use that word because it's probably, if you ask Jeff, it's Jeff from Pine Island Research. I had him on the show a couple of years ago, and he does the show. I do a show on the Untold Radio Network with Doug Hychek, and Jeff does a show over there called Pine Island Research. But he wasn't a podcaster when I met him. He was just an experiencer who, I think he was 18. He was getting ready to ship off for the military. He had just joined up. He and I think his cousin and a couple of friends were kayaking around this island in the Pacific Northwest. I don't remember the exact area. It's the Pine Island area where they're at. Yeah. I don't remember what state. But in a nutshell, they basically pulled up to this island, and one of the kids had to go relieve himself. And Jeff sort of walks up this embankment and walks up this trail. And in hindsight, he looks back now and thinks that he surprised this thing, because this Sasquatch steps out onto the trail, and it's carrying this large, probably 6 to 8 inch diameter, you know, maybe 3 or 4 foot section of a log in its hand for whatever reason. Wow. And it sort of, when Jeff stepped out, it was surprised, he was surprised, and it sort of chunked this thing at him, and it hit him in the chest, and he knocked him down, and he kind of rolled down. And in retrospect, and Jeff just wrote a book about his experiences and his research that just came out recently, but I had him on the show to talk about the book recently, and I said something about him being assaulted by a Bigfoot, and Jeff says, I don't really think that was its intention. I don't think that's what it set out to do. I don't think it was an aggressive thing. I think it was more of a surprise thing. But nonetheless, he was hit in the chest by a log that was thrown by a Sasquatch. So, and I've had other people on the show. I just did a show recently with a lady from Louisiana, and it brought back a show that I'd done early on, probably episode 15 or 20 on the show. I had a guy on that had a situation where they had a couple of dogs out in the woods with them, and the dog ran off into the woods, and they knew that there was something there. They were pretty sure it was a Sasquatch, and the dog was killed. The dog was killed and thrown about 50 to 100 feet back where they were. So that was a pretty aggressive experience as well. So, and then they had something else go on where an unrelated incident where, unfortunately, what they believed to be a Sasquatch stomped one of the dogs and killed it. So really aggressive things going on, but that's only 3 or so instances that
out of this myriad stories.
Out of a myriad of stories, right? So, I think there's a lot of aggression in some of the vocalizations. There's a lot of aggressions in bluff charges and things like that people report. Do we know what it is? Probably not. It's all subjective. You can read into it what you want. Was it being aggressive? Was it protecting something? Was it protecting itself? I don't know. But in general, I would think that most of the encounters I've documented have been innocuous or somewhat benign encounters, but
nonchalant, maybe,
scary nonetheless, right?
No, absolutely. On your podcast, do you only do Sasquatch, or do people tell other stories too, like paranormal or like Dogman or other aliens or anything? Or do you use a big broad paintbrush, or do you use a very narrow paintbrush on your podcast?
It's funny you should ask, Bob, because I did start to paint with sort of a broader brush, because what happens typically, at least for me, I'll speak about my show. I can't speak for other people, but for my show, what was happening for me is somebody comes on and they're talking about a Sasquatch encounter, right? They had a Bigfoot encounter. They saw it while they were hunting in the woods. They walked under their tree stand while they were deer hunting, whatever. I say that's as normal as it gets, right? As normal as seeing an 8 to 9 foot bipedal upright walking ape that's not supposed to exist can be. But what started happening for me is I would say, well, have you experienced anything else that was kind of weird, or did you see any other weird things while you were out in the woods? And they would start talking about lights, and they would start talking about lights in the sky, or they talk about seeing orbs, or sometimes it was seeing little people. I've had people that had talked about seeing little people in the woods.
Just kind of spun off in the other directions then.
Exactly. So, and some of my listeners weren't really into that. So I started a completely different podcast. I started the Paranormal Odyssey Podcast, probably late 2021, early 2022. And it was to put those kind of stories. Now, I have had a couple of people on the show. I think 3 people now I've interviewed so far in the entirety of the Sasquatch Odyssey that have had Dogman experiences. So it sort of runs the same vein, in my opinion, as Sasquatch. So I kind of keep those on this channel. But the Paranormal Odyssey, it went into alien abduction stories. I've had some really fascinating interviews with people who have claimed to fly alien ships and have all kinds of strange paranormal experiences, right? So I gave that show up. I have a new host for that. Wayne does a really great job hosting that. He took that over like October or November of last year. So
that's great.
And he does Bigfoot stuff as well, but it's more of, psychic mediums and some of the ghost stuff, the UFO stuff. So you get a little variety, if you will, of everything.
Yeah, and I like variety, obviously.
Variety is good, right?
Well, I don't want to steal his thunder, but now Tex, who's like a brother to me, he has a Dogman encounter. Like I said, I don't want to steal his thunder by telling his story, but I'm glad there's another there's an outlet there for other people that have Dogman stories as well to tell. Now, I want to go back up a little bit. You mentioned your friend Jeff earlier, who's written a book as well. Now, what was his first and last name, and what was the name of the book? Do you remember, for people that
it's
were
Jeff
interested?
Harding. His channel is Pine Island Research here on YouTube, okay. And I think the book is called The Pine Island Incident, if I'm not mistaken. Jeff's going to kill me for not getting the name of his book correctly. I'm trying to Google it right now.
Okay. And
But
you
I do believe
also,
it's the Pine Island incident.
but in addition to your podcast and your website, you also have a YouTube channel as well, don't you, Brian?
I do. I do.
Okay, I'll display that right now. So tell us, I mean, I'm going to ask you what we will see on that channel, but I think that's pretty much self-explanatory, isn't it? Sasquatch Odyssey Podcast.
Yeah, it's pretty much the channel is, some of it is just audio. The majority of it that's on there now are the video interviews that I've done with people that have ended up on the audio podcast. And a lot of times what you see in the videos is maybe some evidence that you can't see, obviously, when you're listening in your car on an audio podcast. And I also do a lot of stories. People submit stories that don't necessarily want to sit down for a 45-minute interview. So sometimes I'll compile those stories and I'll just do some really cool B-roll in the background and read some stories for folks. So if you're into that kind of thing, I'm actually narrating a story now it's written by a listener who's actually, she just got a book deal actually out of the stories that she's been writing for my show. And she's writing a Dogman story that has woven itself into Bigfoot, because in her story, Bigfoot and Dogman sort of get into this. Well, I'll let you listen to it.
Sounds great. I'm intrigued.
I just put out chapter 7. It'll drop. Chapter 7 is set to drop tonight at midnight on the audio podcast. But you can see, I think up to chapter 6 is posted on my YouTube channel at this point. So if you're into those kind of stories, and then we also read actual stories of people. I have databases that fortunately friends of mine have put together of real encounters that people have had from around the world. So I'll also pull some of those and just read those stories, because people like a variety, right? Yep. Here we are with this word again.
Thanks for sneaking that in a little bit.
I'm a professional, Bob. I'm going to do it all night. So with that, I like to read the stories, and some people like to listen to the stories, and it just be me reading and narrating. So you got a little bit of everything on the YouTube channel.
And see, my listeners and my audience, like you watching right now, they like variety, especially Van Buren variety. They're now, on a serious note, now. In your experience, and I realize, like the map that I'm standing in front of, Sasquatch can be anywhere in the world. I learned that. I always thought when I watched Legend of Boggy Creek, he's only in Falk. He's only in Falk. No, I found out since then that he can be anywhere in the world. So I'll ask you, Brian, in your experience and the people that have shared their stories with you, and granted, Sasquatch can be anywhere. In your interviews, where do most of the people that you're interviewing spotting these things? There's a particular state that you hear more from than other parts of the country?
It's all over the place, man. I've heard stories from the Pacific Northwest. For people that are into Bigfoot research, they're going to know when I say the 4 horsemen of Bigfoot research, right? They're going to know who those people are. Mm-hmm. And one of those people, the only one that's still living, is Peter Buren. And I had Peter on the show earlier this year. Was it earlier this year or late last year? It's been within the last 6 or 8 months. Peter is in his 80s, so he's not going to be with us forever. And I was very fortunate to be able to get him on the show and have a conversation with him, because the other 3 of the 4 horsemen have passed on years ago. But I got in sort of a tiff with Peter, because he doesn't believe that Sasquatch has ever or will ever exist basically east of the Rockies. So he's thinking everything is west of the Rocky Mountains. And, I had to politely disagree, because I've literally talked to hundreds of people just in the southeastern United States that have had experiences with these things way, way east of the Rockies, right? So when you say they can exist everywhere, I do believe there are parts of the world where there probably there's not enough to sustain an animal that would be this big, and then a breeding population on top of that. So, but there are a lot of people. There are a lot of people who say they don't exist in the United Kingdom. Well, I've had people on the show from the United Kingdom who have shared their experiences. There's the guys that do the Ireland Bigfoot research. I had those guys on, and they've all had experiences with Sasquatch and had visuals of these things in Ireland. So,
Ireland,
very interesting. Mm-hmm. There's still people, I get. When I put those shows out, there are people like, oh, man, how can you say they're in the UK? Well, it's not my experience, right? But they say they're there, so I kind of believe that. But to answer your question, really, they're throughout the United States. I can't if I went back and probably did some sort of a data search, I could probably pull a state out where there might be one or two more encounters than any of the other states. But as far as my show goes, it's really all over the place.
And the people that you've talked to, Brian, again, it's just speculation, but in your opinion, or should I say in their opinion, people you've had on their show, where do they say, in general, where Sasquatch has come from? I'm giving you some. Was it just evolution? Is it alien? Is it paranormal? I've heard those different arguments, but I didn't know if you hear one more than the other.
There are other shows out there who shall not be named that ask that question a lot, and it's something I sort of shy away from, because here's my opinion as a researcher and someone who's really into the subject. I have
no opinion. I was just asking a question.
I got you. So I look at it this way. I don't think we're at the point where we should even be concerned with what they are and where they come from. Mm-hmm. We're still trying to prove that they're real. So that's sort of where my focus is. But when I do ask that question, and I do on occasion ask that question because I'm curious about people's experiences and what they believe, it runs the gamut, because you get into what's called the woo. Everybody talks about the woo and Bigfoot, that people believe they're dropped off by alien ships and they're interdimensional and they can cloak and they have all of these superhuman or super abilities that they have. And then you have the flesh and blood camp on the other side that just believes there's some sort of relict hominoid or hominin or hominid that may be an offshoot of Gigantopithecus. I personally believe if it's an evolutionary thing, and I'm sort of in that camp of the flesh and blood, I believe it's some sort of an Australopithecine possibly that came over on the land bridge, like so many other animals that are here now. But it runs the gamut, because there are tons of people in it. It really boils down, really, Bob, to your experience, right? If you experience something that's really out there and it's a really supernatural sort of, I prefer high strangeness, really. I've sort of changed from the woo to calling it high strangeness. But if you have a highly strange encounter with something, are you going to believe that it's just some ape in the woods, or are you going to lean towards maybe this may be something more to that? Maybe it's an alien creature, maybe it's something interdimensional, or it has these supernatural abilities. Again, it just depends on your experience. So that question really runs the gamut depending on the experience of the person. If they're a hunter in a tree stand and this thing runs up and grabs a deer and snaps the deer's legs and throws the deer over its back and takes off into the woods, that's a very flesh and blood thing. So they're probably going to say this is some kind of ape that's evolved, or it's went undetected for all these years. Whereas if you have an experience where you see orbs, or maybe you see lights in the sky and you see something that looks like it's cloaking, like the Predator movies that we've all seen, back in the day, that's an experience that people report. Or you hear mind speak. You think this thing is speaking to you. That's more of a supernatural thing, and you're probably more likely to say, no, I don't think this is just some relict hominoid, hominin, or what have you. I think it's maybe more to it than that. So that really depends on people's perspective after they have the experience with whatever they have the experience with.
And I've heard several stories myself, so I'll just bring that by you. Do a lot of people say that they're either like hairy brown or they hairy black hair? And I've also heard they smell as well. So have you heard those stories as well?
Yeah, the hair color varies, but typically it's a cinnamon brown, dark brown, black. I interviewed somebody recently who had claimed to have experiences with seeing adults that were more brown, cinnamon brown color to even gray as they aged. Wow. And he said that typically the juveniles, or what he believed to be juveniles that he saw, were really, really dark black. But that, it's usually those colors. You don't really hear anything outside of that. There's occasionally, you hear solid white ones, which are really strange. Sometimes I've heard stories about, I haven't personally heard the story from someone, but I've heard it on other shows and from other people that have talked about specific areas where there was one, I think, that had a white mark on its chest that was very unique. And that's how they knew that people were seeing the same individual over multiple years, really decades, was because of that very unique mark, right? It wasn't just this black blob people were seeing. It was something that was very unique because of that particular marking on the chest. So, but yeah, it runs the gamut again. But typically dark brown, cinnamon brown, or black is what I've been using. There was a second part of that question that I forgot.
The smell. I've heard they smell.
Exactly. That's a really good question, because in my experience, probably 10 to 15% of the stories that I've documented, people mention smelling something. Most of the time they don't. So that's sort of I won't say it's a myth. I don't know exactly what to attribute it to, because it sort of becomes synonymous with Bigfoot in a way. You know, they have big feet.
Yeah, sure. Obviously.
You see big footprints, you know, they're really hairy, they're gigantic, and they make really weird noises. They vocalize, and they smell bad. And, you know, I've come to believe, you know, a couple of different things. Again, my opinions change, right? If you have an opinion today and then I talk to somebody tomorrow who has a different experience, my experience and my opinion may change based on that, right? But as I sit here today, I tend to lean towards maybe the smell being more of an environmental thing, right? If you're out in the woods, I mean, we as people, you know, I like to shower. I'm a twice a day shower. I like to shower in the morning and before I go to bed.
Zestfully clean, right?
Exactly. But if I don't shower and you put me out in the woods in a really horrible environment, in a swampy environment, and I'm out there go camping for 2 weeks without a shower and see what you smell like, right? So I don't necessarily think it's something unique to Bigfoot, in my opinion. Again, I'm not an expert. I don't even play one on television, but it's my opinion that it's probably an environmental thing, because if I did the breakdown and the research, and I'm just going on my memory, which is horrible, I would tend to believe that out of that 10 to 15%, probably 98 or 99% of that 10 to 15% that I have documented personally have been in the southern United States, Florida, Georgia, Tennessee, in the Carolinas, in the summertime. So, you know, you do the math and put it together again. You know, if it's 90 degrees and the humidity's 98%, you're probably not going to smell great unless you're bathing regularly. So,
well, I'm in Texas, and for the last week and this week, our temperature highs have been 103, 104, 105, and last week we got up to 108. So I know exactly what you're talking about right there.
There you go.
I'll ask you this. In your research, and maybe just, I'm talking about the people that you've talked to that have shared their encounters, or maybe they're speculative, kind of more about Sasquatch. I mean, who he is and what it is. Has there been any research, or has anybody given you any feedback, or as far as their diet? Are they meat eaters? Are they more vegetarian? Or has that ever been discussed or, hypothesized?
Oh, absolutely. I've had that conversation numerous times. I've had Dr. Jeff Meldrum. Anybody who's into Bigfoot knows who Jeff Meldrum is. And I've had those conversations with people like academics like Jeff and asked those questions. Obviously, it's all subjective because we don't know. But Jeff compared them, Dr. Meldrum compared them to black bears, the black bear population. It's a very... we were talking specifically about, I think I asked him the question about population and what the possible population may be just in the continental United States for Sasquatch. And he compared it again to the black bear population. Not that necessarily, if you got 35,000 black bear in your state, like we do here in North Carolina, you probably don't have 35,000 Sasquatch. That's not what we're saying. But if you're just looking at an environment where they could survive, and possibly, postulate what the population may be in that area, you should look at the black bear population. And anywhere that could sustain, a breeding population of black bear could also possibly sustain a breeding population of Sasquatch. So that would probably mean they're more omnivores, just like black bear. Everybody thinks of black bears, or just bears in general, are these killing machines, but they're primarily omnivore. They're omnivores, right? They eat berries, they eat bushes, they eat leaves, they eat fruit, and meat is great, obviously. But most people attribute them being just strictly meat eaters because when you see those cool National Geographic shots, they've always got they've either just taken down a deer and they have a big deer leg in their mouth, or they're on the salmon run, and that's really cool for television. But that's a rarity for them. It's a one time a year thing. The rest of the time they're scrapping for berries and that kind of stuff. That's why when you find bear scat, we find bear scat here on our property in North Carolina. We know we have at least
Oh,
3 black
wow.
bear. We've seen a mom and 2 cubs a couple of years
Really?
ago.
Oh, man.
And we find bear scat in the areas where we go down by our creek. You find berries mostly. Berries and twigs and other things. It's not, it's not a typical meat eater kind of scat that you find. So I said all that to say I think Sasquatch is probably very similar to a black bear. I think they're probably opportunistic, just like a black bear. If they come across something that they can eat that's meat, they're going to take it. I've had stories about people thinking that they're having hunting parties and they're taking deer down and they're hunting with 4 or 5 individuals and they're putting this deer into a certain area. There's all kinds of stories out there about what they could do or what people think they do. But in my opinion, I think they're probably omnivores and they eat a variety of different things depending on where they are, right?
Well, Sasquatch, we hear about, when humans and Sasquatch, they cross paths, In your research and from the people you've talked to, is it your opinion or other people's opinion that Sasquatch either A, try to avoid people altogether, or are they just curious? Are they curious about us and maybe sometimes that's how our paths cross, or even option 3, do humans inadvertently go into Sasquatch's territory? So that's a lot of coverage there. So do you have an opinion about that, or other people have said about when we cross paths, is it accidental or on purpose?
That's a very good question. It's something that I've talked about ad nauseum with people on the show, and everybody subscribes to their own beliefs, right? So again, it depends on, there's that camp out there that maybe believes that there's a little bit more to these things than just a flesh and blood creature, and they show themselves to the people that they want to show themselves to. There's sort of that camp. I tend to believe, my opinion is this: I think they're very elusive. They're obviously elusive because there's a lot of people that have been looking for them for a lot of years. And, outside of a couple of things, the Patterson-Gimlin film, possibly the Paul Freeman footage from 92 and some other things speckled in and out of there, right? We still don't have any definitive proof that they exist. So they would have to be very elusive just by nature to survive this long. And I can't really say undetected because I've talked to 300 plus people that say they've detected them by seeing them or hearing them or experiencing them, right? But to be proven by science, let's use that as the sort of the line of demarcation there, but they would have to be elusive. So I think it's a combination of all of those things. I joke about it on the show some that, these are the most elusive creatures ever. I mentioned Peter Byrne earlier. Peter Byrne has been looking for Bigfoot for 60 years and he's never seen one. He's never gotten close to having an experience with one, but yet, 2 or 3 times a month, we'll hear on my show or other places where somebody's driving along and they almost hit one on the highway with a Prius, right? Because they're crossing the road. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a combination of all of those things. I think as we as humans encroach farther into possibly their territory, we're building houses in places that we'd never have before. The territories that they can survive in may be shrinking like other animals.
Sure. Suburbia.
They're going to be driven. I used to think when I started researching and looking into this, you had to be sort of like Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin. You had to be 8 miles deep into the woods to have an experience with one of these things. But that hasn't been the case with a lot of these stories that I've documented. They're really on the periphery. They're right on the edges of society. Sometimes even in, some of these really country, rural areas. People are in subdivisions that their houses back up to woods in a subdivision and they're having these things come in the backyard. So I think it's a combination of all of the above. I think, I don't really subscribe to the Sasquatch have some sort of innate ability to detect the person that they're showing themselves to. I don't really ascribe to that. So I think it's more about opportunity. I think they get discovered inadvertently a lot of times. I've recently had, I think 3 or 4 people from the North American Wood Ape Conservancy that have been on the show, and they've been out in this area in Oklahoma called Area X. And people in the Bigfoot community are probably very familiar with the North American Wood Ape Conservancy. They've been on tons of documentaries.
Sure.
sure you've seen Daryl Collier, who's been on the show, Michael Mays, Brian Brown has been on the show, Matt Pruitt's been on the show. So you've heard us talk about some of the things that they've done there. Well, I just had Daryl on the show, I don't know, 2 months ago. They've been out there at that time, they'd been out there for a collective, I think he said 1,500 hours they had spent out at Area X in collective research with the team. And they've had, I think he said at that point, 3 sightings that have lasted for about 3 seconds each.
Wow.
So
3 seconds. Wow.
So 1,500 hours in the woods of research where they know these things are. They know there's a population of them there. They've been interacting with them for about 13 years now, off and on. And 1,500 hours spent looking for them diligently, around the clock, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They've had people on the ground during this course of time, and they've seen them 3 times, and it's lasted about 3 seconds per sighting. So you're looking at less than 10 seconds of sightings and 1,500 hours of research.
1,500 hours. Wow.
That's pretty elusive, right? And they're there. So imagine what it's like for people who are just out in the woods and say, I've been hunting for 45 years and I ain't never seen nothing. Well, there's a good reason for that. I don't think you ever will unless you're really looking for them, because, again, if you compare the regular hunter that just goes out to the same general 4 or 5 miles hunting, think about the chances of you actually seeing something that's this elusive. So I don't know. I think it's a combination of all the above, and most of the people that I've talked to on the show would agree with me. I think it just depends, right? You can you luck up and see one? Sure. I think that's what happened with Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin. They were looking for it, but there had to be some luck involved in them finding it. They turned the corner and there she was.
There she was, yeah. Well, what about people? Now, a lot of people go out, like you said, they go out and go, camping and go researching and what they call squatching, So for people like me, who's a novice, obviously, I've been out in one. But for people that maybe are thinking about doing this, I mean, they're serious about it. It's not a joke. They really want to, see if they can have a sighting, Sasquatch. What are some of the supplies that they should take with them? I mean, specifically for their protection as well.
That's a really good question. I do that on my property. People ask me that all the time. Do I go out on regular Bigfoot expeditions? No. I do the majority of my research behind the microphone, documenting people's experiences. But I am going out on our property here, and I used to do night hikes, but we've heard some really strange vocalizations that, frankly, I didn't want to hear up close. And I certainly didn't want to meet whatever it was in the middle of the night.
You heard sounds.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Oh, wow.
So I don't do the night hikes here anymore. But just recently, 3 weeks ago, we went out for a hike here on the property, and I found a footprint on the property in the creek.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So if you follow me on social media, you can see it on my social media.
I will do that.
It's on the Sasquatch Odyssey Instagram. It's on the Sasquatch Odyssey TikTok. I think I might have even put it on YouTube. I don't remember. But I wasn't doing anything. I wasn't researching. I wasn't looking for anything. I was actually getting away from work. We weren't going to do anything Bigfoot related that day. I wasn't even going to take my phone with me. And we went out and started looking in, an area that we'd never hiked. We have 40 acres, so we still have places on the property that we haven't hiked to. And I'm stepping across a creek and I find what looks like a footprint. And, I jokingly said, wow, that looks like a footprint. And the more I looked at it, I was like, I'm going to take my cell phone out and take a picture of this. This is really cool. I thought it was pareidolia. I thought it was just something that looked like a footprint. And the more I looked at it, it was an impression in the mud. And there was 5 toes. And it was pushed down in the front more than it was in the back. And I'm like, no, this is a footprint, right?
That is, wow.
So, yeah, I've started doing a little research. And again, for people who have listened to the show, they know who Todd Standing is. He's a pretty controversial figure in the Bigfoot community. I've had some run-ins over the years with calling Todd a hoaxer. I don't believe that the videos that he puts out there are real, but to his credit, he eventually came on my show and we talked about it. We had a very good conversation about his videos. And he has invited me. Well, it was going to happen, or was supposed to happen last year. He invited me up to BC, Canada to go out and do a week-long expedition in his area. If you've seen the Discovering Bigfoot documentary on, I think it's on Amazon, can find it on most of the streaming networks. I'm going to the area where that was filmed, where he took Dr. Jeff Melvin, where he took
What an honor.
Dr.
Wow.
Bendernagel, and I'm going up there in October. I'll be there the first week in October. So I'm going to spend a week out in the woods with Todd.
Good luck.
And I'm hoping that we have an experience, so it'll be it'll be the first big Bigfoot expedition that I've been on. So to your point about equipment, one of the things that I'm taking with me is a good way to film video and audio, obviously. And I'm investing in, they're supposed to be here tomorrow. I'm really excited about my new audio recorders. So I'm taking some audio recorders with me because my plan while I'm there is to record 24 hours a day the entire time that I'm there. I'm going to have
absolutely
one recorder out there trying to record sounds. And I'm going to do that here on my property too, because like I said, we've experienced some Ohio howl type vocalizations. We've experienced some other strange vocalizations that I really can't explain, some howls and stuff like that. So I'm going to start using those on my property between now and October, and then I'm obviously going to take them with me. And I'm going to take binoculars and just, there's really no rhyme or reason, honestly. I'm sure if you talk to 10 researchers that are out in the field, boots on the ground, you'll get 10 different answers about, what's the go-to. Like, you got to have thermal, you got to have a parabolic mic. I'd love to have all of those things, but I don't do enough of that research to really warrant me putting a bunch of money into that type of equipment. Now, who knows what happens in BC, Canada? I may come back and invest in some of that stuff because if I have an experience there that really drives me to really want to try to document that here, then I may do that. But, I'm taking the basic stuff, some audio recorders, a good way to film good quality video and certainly audio. And then, I can't carry my gun with me, but when I'm out here in North Carolina on my property, I'm always packing. So I think that's a smart move anytime you go into the woods anywhere.
See, you're going October. So,
yeah, I think I'll be there October the 2nd through the 9th is the plan. So
love to have you back on the show if you don't mind coming back here. We'd love to hear about your experiences. Of course, you'll talk about it on your podcast, but I'd love to hear it here as well.
Yeah, my plan is to actually, for my show, I'm going to get, Kyle is going to be sort of my personal guide. Kyle Deshane's been on the show before. And Kyle has been up there several times with Todd, and he's had experiences while he's actually had a visual sighting of one of these things. So I'll be with Kyle and Todd, and my plan is to have those guys back on the show. I haven't had Todd on in a couple of years. So once it's over, whatever happens, however it shakes out, I'm going to invite he and Kyle back on the show so we can sort of do an analysis and a breakdown and share some of the audio and video or whatever else that we happen to capture. Whether we do or not, I don't know. But we're going to share what happens, and then obviously I wouldn't have a problem coming back over here at all.
Sure. Well, while we're on the subject, we mentioned this at the start, but you said you have people that come on and tell you about their experiences, and because people maybe that are afraid, what the quote unquote the general public might think, but they can come to you and share their experiences. So for people that are watching this live or they're watching this days, weeks, months from now, and they have an experience, maybe they've been wanting to share it with somebody but afraid to tell their stories, how would they get a hold of you? What's the best way for them to contact you and so that you can kind of link up with them and they can share their stories with you, Brian?
The best way to do it is email. I get tons of, I was at the conference this weekend and I had tons of people coming up and sharing their experiences at the table with me, which is fantastic. I don't remember any of them. So the best way for you to do it is to send me an email, brian@paranormalworldproductions.com. If you go over to the website, you'll see that contact form there. It comes directly to me.
This one here?
Yes, paranormalworldproductions.com. You can see, you scroll down at the bottom, you'll see my picture. It says contact Brian. It'll send me an email directly. People reach out to me all the time on Instagram. They message me on Instagram. They message me on Facebook. They message me even on TikTok. And that's great. I appreciate it. But my answer is always, please send me an email because I have so many of those. It is impossible to keep up with. But at least with email, we track that every day. Either it comes to me or Danny reads those emails and then makes sure that they get forwarded to me. And I respond to every single email. It baffles people for whatever reason that I am the one that responds to the email, but I read every single one and I respond to every single one. So that will never change. So if you've had an experience and you want to talk about it, you want to come on the show, send me an email and we'll make sure it happens.
Well, I'll probably be one of those that will send an email. Again, as my audience knows, I don't have a Sasquatch story, but definitely got a paranormal story that will make your hair stand on end. So
I'd love to hear it.
Still makes mine as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, go to Brian's website, paranormalworldproductions.com. Send him an email. If you or anybody else you know has a story, I'm sure Brian would love to hear that. That would be really, really good. And you said I'll talk about more about your show now. You've been doing this for about 2 years now?
Yeah. February of this year was 2 years, so a little over about 2.5 years now.
We're almost the same time. My first show here at Van Buren Variety was March the 23rd, 2021. So but you're doing so much better, and I'm very, very, very happy for you. I'm glad there's a forum out there. Again, Tex has one too. So there's so many out there. In fact, just watching the show, North Alabama Cryptid Mr. and Mrs. says, Sasquatch Odyssey, I subbed. Thank you very much for that.
Awesome. Thank you guys. I appreciate it.
So what would be your advice? It's kind of one of those, you don't know what you're going to do until you get on it. But say somebody's out in the woods and maybe they're not squatching. Okay, they're minding their own business, or fishing, or they're just out camping, and they see one of these things. Do you freeze? Do you run? Just kind of give us what would be your advice.
My advice would be treat it like a bear. That's what I've always told myself.
Play dead or what?
I would do. No, I tell you what I did. We were hiking here on the property. I think it's probably been closer to 3 years ago now. We were hiking to the back of the property. It takes about 45 minutes when we leave the house to get to the top of the ridge at the back of our property. And we were right there on the cusp. And we're coming up this little gully area, and it's kind of high on either side. And we're probably 25 yards maybe away from the top of the ridge. So we're almost there. We're give out, we're torn up. We've been going through briars to get through to this area. And I look over, and about 20 feet away, there's this huge black face looking at me, and it was a big mama black bear.
Oh, wow.
And she's coming, her face is stuck out of this little den in the side of the ridge there. And she comes out, and she starts huffing, and she's smacking the ground, and then behind her, 2 cubs walk out. Pretty decent size. They weren't tiny cubs. They were pretty decent sized cubs. I imagine they were probably a year old at that point.
I see.
And they turn. One goes to the left, the other one goes to the right, and I'm thinking, oh, we're in trouble, because I thought she's going to tear us.
Oh yeah, protective mama bear. Mm-hmm.
Right. So then he was in front of me. We had a pistol, a 40 caliber pistol, but it was in the backpack. So I had to get the pistol out of the backpack. I'm like, just go ahead, move slowly to the right. I stare mama down in the face. We're in a staring contest. I let her know I wasn't moving. She wasn't moving towards me. I wasn't moving towards her. And we was able to get on up, and we're just kind of in gridlock, right? I'm staring in the face. And
stand your ground.
Right. Stand my ground. She finally she smacked the ground again, kind of huffed, and then she took off, and she just turned around and slowly walked off towards where the direction her cubs went. So everybody handles things differently. That's how I've always been taught to handle a black bear. You kind of stand your ground. Black bear are usually pretty skittish. Now, it's a different ball game when you're talking about a grizzly. There's not a whole lot you can do there. I think you're screwed. So I would say the same thing with a Sasquatch. I would definitely not run. That's a bad thing to do when you're talking about a predator. Running is never a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
I've had people on the show that have ran and survived and lived to tell about it.
Wow.
But, outside of that, I really don't know, man. I don't think there is a right answer to that. I guess it would depend on what it was doing. If it was being aggressive, I've talked to plenty of hunters who have been in situations who claim that they could have taken a shot and they just couldn't do it. And it wasn't because the thing was being aggressive, but, they were just, I don't know what this is, and there's also been people who have claimed to have shot them. I talked to a guy in the parking lot heading into the conference on Saturday morning, and I walk up. I just got there and parked, and Wayne was standing out there with a couple of buddies of his before we went in to start the conference. And the guy walks off, and he's like, Wayne looks at me and says, that guy was talking about he had shot a Sasquatch years ago. So I can't wait to hear that story. I think we're going to get him on the show. But it runs the gamut. But my opinion, my experience, I would say you choose your battles. If you feel like you need to stand your ground, you probably should. If you feel like you need to climb a tree, you probably should. And if all else fails, you think you need to be running for your life, you probably should. So listen to your gut. That's
trust you. I was gonna say, trust your gut right here. You know,
right, trust your gut.
Oh. Well, Brian, it's been a wonderful, wonderful interview. I've learned a lot, both from you and from my buddy Tex. And I would encourage my audience here, those of you that are watching this live, check out his podcast. That's Sasquatch Odyssey Podcast, Sasquatch Odyssey Podcast, as well as his website, paranormalworldproductions.com. That's paranormalworldproductions.com. And that way you can send him an email and share your stories, not just about Sasquatch, but about paranormal. Anything else you'd like to talk about. So, Brian, it sounds like you've got a great thing going. I appreciate your time. And I wish you the best of luck in British Columbia in October when you're doing your research. And I can't wait to hear about it myself.
I appreciate it, Bob. Thanks for having me, man.
Okay. Have a great night, Brian.
You too.
And ladies and gentlemen, that's going to do it all for tonight's episode of the Van Buren Variety Show. But remember, I'm on the air every Tuesday evening at 7 p.m. Central Time. That's 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Where next week I'll have another guest, and it'll be another topic. So you don't know what it's going to be. If it's music, is it research? Is it a hobby? Is it a profession? Make sure you hit that subscribe button, and you'll find out for sure. So, and if you like the show tonight, if you like Brian's presentation on the Sasquatch and his podcast, make sure you hit that like button. And if you have a question for Brian and you didn't get a chance to do it in the live chat, make sure you leave a comment. I'll make sure that Brian will see that when you send that to me. So that's all from me tonight. I appreciate you tuning into the Van Buren Variety Show. I am Bob Van Buren. I will see you next week. Good night, everybody.